May the words of my mouth and the meditations of each heart be holy and acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. A few months ago, a parishioner texted me a meme that said, after turning 35, dads have to really get into one of two things: World War II history or smoking various meats. And I thought, well, can't we do both? Can't dads do both? I mean, we don't have to choose between those two, right? But I did think it was funny, and I think it's kind of true. I know a lot of dads who are into both of those things, but I know a lot of dads who are into history specifically. It's a thing. In fact, it's so much of a thing that not too long ago there was this TikTok social media craze. You might have seen it, where wives would take their phones and record their husband's response to this question: how often do you think about the Roman Empire? Did y'all see that? How often do you think about the Roman Empire? And y'all, it was crazy to see how many dads out there are thinking about ancient Rome on a daily basis. I don't think about that so much, but if my wife were to record and ask me, how much do you think about the history of the American West? I'd say all the time, like multiple times a day. In fact, I was just thinking about it, and then you interrupted me from thinking about it to ask me this silly question, if I ever think about it. And then she'd say something like, well, I need you to stop because we need to do this grocery list together. And I'd say, I'm not done thinking about Quanah Parker and the Comanches at Adobe Walls. And she'd say, oh, is Quanah Parker going to feed you and the kids dinner this week? And then the conversation would be over. That's how that'd go down. But because of all this stuff, there's this pseudo-genre of books called dad history. Dad history. It's true, look it up online. It's right there. Basically, they're the kind of books you'd see under the What to Get Dad for Father's Day section at Barnes & Noble. According to some descriptors of this genre, by even some academic historians, they are histories that place narrative over analysis. It's a history that's trying to tell a story, to paint a picture, not focus on the subtle nuances and certain facts that are a part of more scholarly works of history. Rather, it's about getting to the essence of a person, of a moment, of a movement, which is very much like the kind of history Luke is writing in the book of Acts. See, Luke is not concerned with facts. He's not even attempting a posture of objectivity. Besides, that kind of approach of history really grew out of a particular time period in Western civilization and has now even been called into question by many historians and philosophers many a time. For instance, the philosopher Paul Ricoeur stressed all history is written because of a certain subjective interest and therefore a subjective perspective. You see, the book of Acts, like certain parts of Luke's gospel, possesses a certain subjective interest. It is a history that stresses narrative over analysis. It's getting at the essence of something very important to Luke in the early church. It's getting to something very crucial. And we can hear in it the repeated proclamation from many in the books of Acts, from the mouths of apostles, in which they say, we too were witnesses. We too were witnesses. Acts is written in such a way as to make the reader, the listener, a witness to the movement of God in the church. The historian Luke is like how one person described the work of the Pulitzer Prize-winning historian David McCullough when they said, he paints with words. See, Luke paints with words to help make us witnesses. We see such a painting this morning in our reading from Acts chapter 3. Leading up to this scene, a man born lame, begging outside the temple because he's not allowed in. He's considered unworthy, a castaway, excluded from the worship life of his very own people. Then Peter heals the man, and all are amazed, all are astonished. That's the word used in the text 4 different times, astonished, over and over again. They were all astonished. They're describing the reaction of those gathered around. And what does Peter do? He preaches. He says, this isn't about me or us or our piety. This is about Jesus. But then he does something kind of interesting. He says basically, remember your history. Remember our history. He says, remember God's promises to Abraham and to Isaac and to Jacob. Remember the prophets. Remember what they said. This occurrence of healing would have hearkened the original hearers and readers and listeners to Luke's story. It would have hearkened their imagination back to the words of Isaiah the prophet when he wrote, strengthen the weak hands, make firm the feeble knees. Say to those who are of a fearful heart, do not fear, your God is here. The blind will see, the deaf will hear, the lame will walk. It'll be like water breaking forth in the wilderness and streams in the desert. Well, wait a minute. What about the man born lame? Did that healing really happen? Is that a fact? Is that historically accurate? Wrong question. Not the point. Besides, don't do this. The church has done this for centuries. Don't fall into ableist readings of the scriptures, like God needs our bodies and our minds to be a certain way, to enter into his presence, to enter into the fellowship and community with those gathered. Besides, in a few more chapters in the book of Acts, Luke is going to get to the actual heart of this issue when he has Stephen, the first deacon, preaching a sermon before a crowd. And Stephen is going to say, guess what? God doesn't live in your buildings. God doesn't live in your buildings. Which is a way of saying, good luck trying to keep people out and away from a God who doesn't even recognize your silly rules and stupid barriers you put up. God is bigger, wilder, more loving than you could possibly imagine. Then they stoned him to death. What makes you wonder, why would a deacon ever want to preach after something like that? Remember your history, Peter says. Remember your history. Remember Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. Remember the prophets. And then he says, remember Jesus. Even when you rejected him, even when you executed him, even when you thought it was all over, God didn't stop moving. God raised him from the dead, Peter says. To this, we are witnesses. You see, because for Luke, the cross, the death of Jesus, there's no substitutionary atonement theory in it. There's no theology in Luke that's about the cross as a means to satisfy the justice of an angry God. See, for Luke, the cross was the best no that the powers of the world could dish out in history, but the resurrection of Christ is God's yes in history. And God keeps saying yes. God keeps moving, keeps opening up, keeps expanding. And Luke paints with words the movement of that God in history. The Spirit of God strengthening and steadying. People letting go of fear, splashing through streams in the desert and water in the wilderness. This past Lent, we gathered over there every Wednesday night at St. Alban's room, and we looked at some reflection questions. One of those questions was intended to prepare us for this moment we are in the season of the church called Eastertide. The question, where do you see the Spirit of God at work in a way that surprises you? So I ask again, but in a different way. Where do you see a strengthening of what was once weak? Where do you see a steadying of what was once feeble? Where do you see a surrendering of fear? Where do you see streams of refreshment where there was once only this dry, parched landscape in your life? Where do you see God moving? I wonder what it would be like for each of us in our own way, in our own time, to write down what we see, to paint with our own words the movement of God in our histories. Might be a history worth holding on to, especially in hard times. A history that lets us say together with so many through time, like so many did in the book of Acts, we too are witnesses. Amen.